Moving Through Life. Part 6. Construction and Conversation. It was an odd thing, living with a human. Shay had done so all her life, but it wasn't like he or anyone else knew about her and her family living in the walls. As odd as it was, ever since Shay agreed to stay with Todd, it seemed like everything fell into a sense of normal in no time. Yes, a human was aware of her presence, but all in all, he didn't seem to mind. It wasn't that he didn't care or express concern, but it was more like the novelty of finding a small person was lost on him. He was considerate and kind, checking in on her on occasion, but not asking too many times to make her uncomfortable. More often than not, he was doing something called homework for class. It often involved him staring at various devices and screens, scribbling notes on paper for hours on end. In the morning, he made breakfast and left out a snack. In the evening, he made dinner for both of them. In some way, it felt nice having someone there. Shay couldn't imagine being on her own, trying to survive. It felt like having one of her own brothers there, looking out for her. To keep her from using her hook all of the time, Todd taped and secured stable lines for her to use. For counters and gaps, he placed bridges. He even agreed to make some ladders that led into the walls. Staying inside the walls was one way Shay honored her heritage, while also staying near her roommate. The borrower girl knew she needed to practice and keep her skills sharp, so she spent time in the walls setting up a makeshift camp. Todd even helped remove the face covers of the electrical outlets so she could slip in and out easier. Shay thought about staying in the walls. That's what should have happened the first day she arrived. She thought of what her parents would say, and how her brothers would tease and taunt her, maybe even scold her, at being around a human for so long. The first night alone sleeping in the walls on her makeshift bed told her one thing. She missed home. Furthermore, she didn't want to be alone, even if that meant being with a human. She crept out of the walls that night as Todd breathed deeply, already asleep, and curled back onto the heavenly soft pillow and thick, warm blanket. It wasn't all bad. In fact, most of it was good. There were still times where he moved too fast and she didn't notice him in a room because of how quiet he was when he worked, that she squeaked and retreated beneath whatever was near. However, this lasted for less than 2 days. Immediately after spending 2 days with Todd, she found herself wandering out when he was doing homework and other things. Most of the time, she was keeping her skills sharp for when she arrived back home. Since Todd knew about her, it didn't make sense to hide all day in the walls when she could be practicing out in the open. The borrower teen also realized she had a lot of questions that Todd knew the answers to. Some things were simple, like where humans got their food and what farms were. It was mind-numbing, thinking of fields and fields that would take a year to cross, growing mountains of food. Some questions, however, were more complex, and Todd had to explain it many times for Shay to understand. Things like how that device he wrote on knew what he was doing, and how he could submit a project without bringing it to the other humans. The days passed, and the more they talked, the more Shay realized how advanced the humans were, and how their daily struggles as borrowers were things humans had solved years ago. At least, most of them anyway. A lot of problems borrowers ran into constantly were trivial at best for humans. Another thought came to Shay one night that terrified her after the fact. And that was how much easier life would be if they relied on humans to help take care of them. Immediately, she shook the thought away. The thought of demeaning herself to be a pet for an easier life made her feel choked up, and tears burned the corners of her eyes. What would her parents think of her if she had let this thought slip? No, she had to be strong. Despite how easy things would be, she realized that there was purpose in her life by borrowing. She wanted purpose, for her life to mean something, even if it was just for her. And living with a human to be their pet was no purpose at all. The thought, to Shay, was actually amusing. What could a borrower do to help a human? What purpose could they serve other than being a pet? Within minutes, the thought of this easy life had completely vanished from Shay's mind, and she curled up on the lint pillow under the bed and drifted off into a deep sleep. Nearly a week had passed since Shay had these thoughts about borrowers being pets, and Shay was enjoying some chips Todd had left on the counter of the kitchen when Todd came home. The instinct to hide was there, but easily overridden by seeing her human roommate. She swung her legs off of the edge of the counter as Todd loaded a dozen bags from his arms onto the opposite counter. "Hey, Shay," Todd greeted warmly. "Up and about, I see. Did you sleep okay?" "Yeah, it was great," she replied as she stood and stretched, dusting the crumbs off of her pants. "What have you got there?" Shay knew she wouldn't be able to see, even if she stood on her tiptoes, but she tried all the same. Todd cast a glance over his shoulder and grinned. "All of the good stuff," he proclaimed. "I have some of our favorites for dinner, a new bag of chips we haven't tried yet, and some candy." Shay was delighted at the list, but noticed that he hadn't unpacked all of the bags he brought in. "What's in those?" she asked after he put most of the food away. "Huh? Oh, those are supplies for a project I've been working on. There's a bit of a competition going on right now for who will present at the conference. Whoever wins will get a chance to make a mock proposal to the board, and if it does well there, it'll—" He was about to continue when he saw the partial confusion on Shay's face. "Well, long story short, some really important people may actually see the design I come up with if I can prove my design is stable, and to do that, I need to make a model." Shay was grateful Todd simplified things for her, and now was more fascinated than ever in his modeling thing. "Anyway, I need to get to working on it. No pressure or anything, but do you want me to make you something for dinner now, or just wait it out?" Shay wasn't necessarily hungry, so she shook her head. "I'm okay. Get working on your project thing," she said with a sweet smile. Todd nodded and enthusiastically gathered his building materials and disappeared into the living area to begin working. Shay, in the meantime, decided she should practice opening cabinets on her own from the outside. It was a useful skill to have, and, the more powerful motivator, she wanted to look at the candy boxes he brought home. It took time, but Shay had the fundamentals down of getting her hook onto the cabinet handle, climbing it, and then pulling it free. Bo, her oldest brother, had made a device that helped open and keep cabinets open. But the materials were hard to find. Slate, her middle brother, simply used force by climbing above the cabinets and slipping down from the top. Icon didn't have a technique, but Shay knew he had more practice than her. In between attempts, Shay had to take a breather, but it wasn't enough. She either needed to get stronger or get something to help her. The borrower teen remembered what the pieces and parts looked like, but had no idea where to find them. Then a thought occurred to her. Maybe Todd knew what these pieces were and where to find them. It was settled. Shay retrieved her hook and belayed down to the ground to find Todd. Todd, in the meantime, was hyper-focused on this project. He had printed off all of his blueprints and was making adjustments as needed to accommodate. The base was the easiest part, laying the popsicle sticks down as the floor joists and leaving gaps for the rods he intended to use as posts and wall joists. Each cut and measurement had to be precise and exactly to scale if he was going to succeed. Thankfully, he was diligent and precise. Within a few hours, Todd had a significant portion complete and had only burned 3 of his fingers on the hot glue gun. He sat back in his chair and was about to pull out his phone when he heard a familiar zing of the line and the catch of the hook. Carefully, he glanced over and down to see Shay beginning to ascend to the top of the table. Seeing his tiny roommate climbing the table brought a smile to his face. "And what brings you this way, little lady?" he asked, leaning back as he watched her begin to inch up the line.
"I was wondering if you could help me with something,"
Shay responded in between breaths as she had secured her footing on the line. Todd chuckled. "Probably. I was just about to take a break," he said. "You know, I could give you a hand. This table is pretty tall." Shay locked her position with her feet and stared up at Todd. The momentary break allowed enough time for her muscles to begin shaking. If she stayed clinging to the line and not moving for too much longer, she would undoubtedly have to go back down to the ground. The other option, having Todd quite literally lend her a hand to stand on, was daunting. She hadn't been held or touched by Todd, and her borrower instincts flailed against the idea. Still, her muscles were tiring quickly, and she was already starting to slip down the line. Shay clenched her jaw. She trusted Todd, and had been trusting him for these past few weeks. He had proven himself, time and again, and that was enough for Shay. "I know you can do it on your own," reminded Todd, "but I thought the offer might be nice." Shay partially snorted in amusement. Even now, while he saw her muscles shaking, he wasn't forcing her.
"Okay,"
she said softly with a shy nod. Todd's eyes widened as he suddenly realized what he had just offered. With a subtle nod, he reached down just below Shay and leveled his palm just barely an inch below her. The young borrower's heart rate tripled as the immense hand rested just beneath her. Her body tensed instinctually, and she gingerly lowered herself until she stepped onto the soft surface of his palm. It gave way under her feet like a stiff pillow, but it was far too warm. Shay noticed only now that the tips of Todd's fingers were bandaged and slightly blistered. She knelt and could see all of the ridges on his fingers and on his palm, every line and crease making up this part of his body. His fingers curled instinctually upward, only a fraction of a degree, as the human lifted the teenage borrower from where she was onto the table. It was a rush of motion, reminding Shay of dropping down a line suddenly. It sent her senses tingling and a shiver of excitement up her spine. For a moment, Shay stayed crouched, almost wanting him to do it again, before coming out of her partial daze and stepped off. It was then that she saw the thing he was working on. It was a massive structure, easily 5 times her height. The The building itself had rectangular elements, but there were interesting triangles and circles attached, like it was trying to emulate a pyramid and a dome at the same time. "Whoa," she said, walking up to the wooden structure. "You made this? In just a few hours?" she asked. Todd, still reeling from the sensation of Shay standing and crouching on his hand, simply hummed an affirmative response and nodded. "Yeah, it still needs a lot of work. But I thought I'd give my fingers a rest from being burned. Overall, I'm pleased. There are still a few things on the inside I need to work out, but that'll take time I don't really have." Shay stepped up to the front, realizing the door was just her height. Being so close, she could see he used actual screws just barely larger than her hand to secure the door. She turned around and pointed absent-mindedly at it. "Could I go in?" she asked. Todd's eyebrows raised, taken slightly off guard by the question, but nodded and gestured toward the structure. "Go right ahead. Just be really careful. Some of the glue is still setting, and those elements I'm having trouble with are inside, not really outside," replied Todd. Shay reciprocated the nod and crossed the threshold. Immediately she was astounded. There were walls and nooks and chairs, all on the first floor. The ceiling was far above her and revealed each floor. The dome and the pyramid let her see the ceiling of Todd's apartment, but some of the other areas she could walk into and not worry about hitting her head. There were places that had shelves and spots for coat hooks. If a borrower were to live in a house, this is probably what it would look like. "What do you think?" he asked from the outside. Shay peered around to see his massive eye looking in through one of the windows, a sight that made her startle. When she regained herself, she could only smile. "It's amazing. Do all of the stairs and doors work?" she asked, stepping over the threshold into a smaller side room and began closing the door, which came loose and fell almost on top of her. She yelped and leapt back. "Shay, are you okay? I was just about to say most of them. There were a few things that I haven't quite fixed because it's running into the other design problems," said Todd.
"Oof, yeah, I'm okay,"
huffed Shay, passive-aggressively shoving the door with her foot.
"What design problems? This whole place is amazing."
"You're being way too nice," said Todd, with a roll of his eyes. "For one, some of the doors are running into one another. I thought I accounted for that, but they end up opening into each other, and that's not a great design. Plus, I don't know what to do with the roof. I thought about just covering it, but that'll reduce a lot of natural light. The problem is that if I don't cover it, the overall structure won't be able to sustain the shape. Anyway, it was a good concept, but I may have to go back to the drawing board." Shay stared up at the roof for a minute, thinking about what Todd had said. She didn't understand all of it, but she understood enough.
"Why don't you just put some beams to support it?" she asked.
"I thought about that, but the weight it'll have will put too much pressure on the walls," replied Todd.
"No, I meant here."
Shay began climbing the stairs all the way up until she made it almost to the roof. Then, pointing, began explaining what she meant. Todd's eyes narrowed as his brain began calculating angles, suddenly catching on to Shay's idea. "So use the beams here instead of here?" he asked, pointing to the points on the structure. Shay nodded. That could actually work. Wow, here. Todd seized a handful of popsicle sticks and began placing them with the glue. Slowly but surely, he removed the original supports, and, sure enough, it held. In the meantime, Shay walked around and began readjusting and fixing small things she noticed. Things like the stairs and the frames of the doors. "Hey, what do you know?" said Todd with a pleased grin. "Way to go, Shay." Shay, rather pleased with herself, accepted the human's compliment with a bashful grin, feeling the tips of her ears and cheeks pinken.
"Thanks,"
she said, blushing. "You know, you'd make a good engineer," said Todd, leaning back.
"An engineer?"
"Yeah," said Todd. "Like me, someone who designs and builds stuff." Shay looked around at the structure and felt a swell of pride. Perhaps there was a purpose she could serve here.